Yeah, so there's a small country on the east side of the Bay of Bengal with a population of 171 million people squeezed into the landmass, 2/3 the size of Great Britain. And I think it doesn't get enough attention in mainstream media or even in like the historic textbooks of Marxism. And obviously, this country I'm talking about is Bangladesh. And I think when often people talk about Bangladesh, they think of an economically backward country that's extremely poor. And while it is an extremely poor country, it is now a modern capitalist economy. It's also the second largest garment manufacturer, second only to China. I think this shows the size of its industry. And over the past 20 years, it's overseen rapid economic development. And this has been driven by this garment industry. And the model is very simple. The Bangladeshi capitalists produce cheap garments for foreign multinationals like Primark and Zara. And obviously this requires extremely cheap labour with extremely harsh working conditions. And the Bangladeshi capitalist class, therefore, require a brutally repressive state machine that can keep wages low and keep the population in a state of subservience. And this was the role that Hasina and the Awami League government played for the past 20 years, of which was overthrown this summer. And this regime was mired in corruption and nepotism scandals from its very beginning. And this can be seen in the quota system. I don't know if anyone was following the movement in Bangladesh, but this quota system was essentially a government program that made the best government jobs only available to Awami League supporters and members of the government. And this caused enormous student protests across the country, which culminated in a popular revolution in August, which overthrew the whole regime. While the head of the regime is gone, the whole entire repressive state apparatus still remains intact. And so it means that the revolution is now at a crossroads, which means our job as revolutionaries is to learn the lessons of the past so we can apply it moving forward for the class struggle in Bangladesh and around the world. And I think a really good period to look back on is obviously in the country where the revolution in August came from, which was in Bangladesh, and especially the period between 1968 and 75. And so there was a revolution across the whole of Pakistan, which culminated in a war of independence and the formation of the modern nation state of Bangladesh. During this period, this 7-year period, the working class could have taken power not one, not two, but 3 separate times. And today's revolution is playing out in a very similar way. And I'd say all of the theoretical and practical lessons from this period remain extremely relevant. I'd argue by the end of this talk are even more relevant today than they were when this revolution started. But like Mike was saying in the introduction, these revolutionary traditions of the Bangladeshi people have been distorted and lied about by the 2 parties which benefited from independence, the Awami League and the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, the BNP. Our task, like I said then, is to uncover the truth about this so we can chart the way forward for the movement today. And I think it's first, before we get into the mechanics of the revolution of the 60s and 70s, I think it's important to understand that in order to talk about the subcontinent at all, we have to talk about the role, briefly, of British imperialism. And I'd say all of the blame for the poverty, oppression, destitution, all of the barbarous acts that we've seen across this subcontinent can be laid, the blame of which can be put squarely at the door of British imperialism, who for 200 years subjected the people of the subcontinent to grinding poverty and exploitation. And now, the Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs in 1946 and 47 fought back in a united struggle against British occupation and led a revolution which won them freedom from British colonial rule. Britain had completely lost control of the situation, and in order to keep making profit from the people of the subcontinent, had to divide it. They used the wealthy Hindu and Muslim leaders to divert the class struggle down sectarian, religious and communal lines. Now they used, and this ended in the partition of India, one of the most barbarous and counter-revolutionary acts of modern history. And during this period, an arbitrary line was drawn down the middle of India. Hindus were told to get on their side of the line, while Muslims were told to get on their side of the line. The British withdrew overnight, and absolute carnage ensued. Around 2 million people were killed, 10 to 20 million people were displaced, and thousands of women were raped in, like I said, one of the most barbarous and counter-revolutionary acts of human history. But this was not an inevitable consequence of irreconcilable religious difference, but was instead, like I said, completely and 100% engineered by British imperialism with the help of wealthy landowners and bourgeois members of the Hindu and Muslim elite. And I say this, I talk about partition because it's important to understand how this geographic and political makeup influenced the period ahead of it. So this formed two modern nation states, India, which contained the majority of Hindus, and Pakistan, which contained a majority of Muslims. Within Pakistan itself, you had East and West Pakistan. Now this was separated by 1,200 miles of landmass, which was India. East Pakistan was East Bengal, so Bengal had also been partitioned down the middle, with West Bengal going over to India. East Pakistan, East Bengal, I use them kind of interchangeably throughout, but this is now modern-day Bangladesh. Just to put it into context, from London, 1,200 miles away is Napoli. I think it's Napoli, so it shows Naples even. So it shows you like the length, geographic length. Imagine sharing a British nation-state with the Italians. It would be completely absurd. So yeah, partition was extremely favourable to the wealthy elites who resided in West Pakistan, and especially the landlord and capitalist clique that existed in the Punjab region. And the main industrial centres were also housed in West Pakistan as well. And it therefore meant a small minority of Punjabis were able to amass a considerable wealth at the expense of everyone else throughout the population. I think it's also worth talking about the ethnic makeup of Pakistan. The whole of Pakistan was essentially welded together by the thin thread that they were all shared the same religion, and yet it was made up of dozens of different ethnicities, of which Pashtuns, Kashmiris, and at this point Bengalis. And these massively outnumbered the Punjabi minority, who then outnumbered again a tiny minority of Punjabi landlords and capitalists. For example, during this period, 22 West Pakistani families, mainly originating in this region of the Punjab, owned 66% of industry and 80% of banking across the whole of the country. East Pakistan was also a captive market for goods that were also made in the West, and the average wage of someone of a Bengali in East Pakistan was £15 a month, whereas those in West Pakistan were £35 a month. And while East Pakistan had gone from direct British rule, it had then gone to West Pakistani rule immediately after partition. And so the government in Pakistan essentially existed to defend this right of a minority of property owners to exploit the majority of the population, who were all mainly from these ethnic groups like Bengalis. And they excluded minorities from political power, and one of the ways that they did this was through, social and political repression. One of these was to make Urdu the official language. Only 7% of the population at the time said they spoke Urdu as their first language, whereas 55% of people spoke Bengali as their first language. And this was purely to exclude Bengalis and other ethnic minorities from political power, because all of the official government documents were done in Urdu. And this was reflected in the makeup of the government itself. So 90% of the army elite were, 90% of which were from West Pakistan. The elite civil service, only 16% of this were Bengali. And so the elite military caste, the government bureaucrats who are massively corrupt, and the West Pakistani ruling class, so this landlord capitalist, the super wealthy elite, they were completely intertwined in the military state machine, which was used to keep the population completely subservient so that it could continue exploiting them economically. So we can see here how the national oppression of Bengalis was therefore an essential cornerstone in the defence of the power and privileges of this small handful of capitalists and landlords who resided in West Pakistan. And this was a recipe for social explosions. And this happened day one after partition. And the 1950s saw an intense period of class and national struggles, with mass protests breaking out over the recognition of the Bengali language. You had the election of a Bengali nationalist front, which was quickly dissolved about 53 days later. And also this culminated in the recognition of the language in 1956. But it was through this period of the 1950s of brutal state repression, of class and national struggles through the masses, of which the modern Bangladeshi national consciousness was forged. And towards the end of the decade, this was mired by complete chaos, instability, class and national struggles. And therefore, the West Pakistani ruling class demanded order, and they needed a strongman leader of which to defend their interests. And this came in 1958 with Army officer Ayub Khan, who led a successful military coup and ruled with a military dictatorship, implemented martial law. He banned political gatherings, whipped up sectarian violence and pogroms, which also included the increased repression and oppression of Bengalis. Now, under Ayub Khan, trade unions were essentially made illegal, and what this meant was wages could be kept really low and they could attract lots of US foreign investment, and plus they began to build US military bases in Pakistan. So like I said earlier, there was a revolving door between the military tops, the corrupt government bureaucrats, and the ruling class. And so and it was all to defend the interests of this class. And so therefore they had no interest in forming a modern democratic nation state, of which Pakistan was supposed to be. That was what they sold to the Pakistani people, to the Muslims, that we'd be able to form a modern democratic nation state. But the basis of a modern democratic nation state would be, firstly, free and fair elections. So you can see in a country that was made up of multiple different, a majority of different ethnic minorities, which were all exploited by one tiny minority, you can see how the allowing of free and fair elections would basically mean the immediate breakup of the state of Pakistan. So again, this would mean loss of super profits from this wealthy class of landowners and capitalists. So again, they were not willing to give this concession. Secondly, what was following on from this would be the establishment of a separate nation state for Bengalis. Again, East Pakistan was essentially a colony of West Pakistan. Like, why would the West Pakistani ruling class allow a loss of one of the greatest sources of power and privileges and income? Third of which would be a land to the peasantry. Most of this land was, like I said, owned by this small group of landowners and capitalists. And they made lots of money from charging extortionate rents to the poor peasantry. And so again, they were not willing to break up their own landed estates and give land to the peasantry. So therefore, as long as the property ownership of the West Pakistani ruling class, so the landlords and the capitalists, remained intact, then a modern democratic nation state was impossible. And no genuine democratic reforms could be won on this basis. And so, following on from this, the 1960s was a period of accelerated economic and industrial growth. And this, yes, while it made super profits for the capitalist, it also produced, on the other side, a very, very powerful yet small working class who were ruthlessly exploited in modern factories. And while the military, the military elites, the government officials, the ruling class were openly corrupt and flaunting their wealth. Just on a side point, I don't know if anyone's actually watched a Bollywood film, but it's usually about a wealthy landlord or business owner, and they have some of the most outrageous mansions I've ever seen, with dozens and dozens of servants waiting on their beck and call. Imagine what this would have looked like to a Bengali earning £15 a month. They would have been... They were completely disgusted with this open flaunting of wealth and openly corrupt government. To add to this, Pakistan went to war with India in 1965, which ended in a complete disaster. This exacerbated inflation, the cost of living crisis. And in order to justify the war, Ayub Khan and government officials whipped up sectarian pogroms and violence against Hindus, but particularly they included Bengalis in this. They said, treat Bengalis like you would treat Indians, that they're Hindu-like, and they deserve to be purged, and things like this. And this only intensified the feeling of national oppression from Bengalis on top of the economic exploitation. And so, like the shifting of tectonic plates beneath the Earth's surface, there are extreme tensions building up across the whole of Pakistani society. The contradictions were piling on top of each other, one after the other, and threatening to tear the very fabric of Pakistan apart. And Ayub Khan, all of this point, understood what was going on beneath the surface and was desperately trying to put a lid on things. But every time he tried to erase a contradiction, and it only exacerbated everything else. And eventually, the volcano would have to erupt. And it finally exploded in 1968 after a student was murdered by police in West Pakistan. This then spread across the entire country. Ayub Khan had a revolution on his hands. And so before I get into talking about the mechanics of the revolution itself, I think it's important to note two main political parties at this point who were leading the movement. So firstly, you had the Awami League, who we will have all heard of if we've been following the revolution in Bangladesh recently. But this was led by Mujibur Rahman, and he was he's the father of Hasina, who was recently deposed. And this was a petty bourgeois, middle-class Bengali nationalist party. And their program at that time was called the 6-Point Program. And it was essentially like a moderate set of democratic demands. And this included the formation of an autonomous nation state, control over internal affairs, control over their economy, and universal suffrage. And then secondly, another important party to understand at this point was called the National Awami Party, which was called the NAP, led by Red Maulana Bashani. And this was a Maoist party which had an active base in the students and peasantry. And they essentially had a perspective of a peasant war beginning in the countryside, just as Mao's Communist Party did in China. But we'll talk about the role of these parties later on. So back to the revolution. So between November and January, the revolution was gaining pace. Students and ordinary people were joining mass demonstrations across the whole country. Every student or lecturer that was murdered by the police, thousands more joined in their numbers. And in January, a significant point was reached in the formation of all student party action committee. And this was essentially a committee of the most revolutionary students who would go on to further organise the revolution and bring more layers into it. Just like today, the students became the most courageous and the bravest fighters who put themselves at the head of the revolution. However, Ayub Khan's regime was not moving an inch, while at the same time, brute repression was having diminishing returns. And in February, he announced elections for some distant time in the future. But he also said that he wouldn't run in these elections. And then a day later, released Mujib from prison, who at the time had been arrested by the Pakistani authorities. But in the eyes of the masses, this was an enormous victory. While it was such a big victory, it wasn't yet enough to topple the regime. And what came next was a very important, I'd say, very significant point in the revolution, which changed the entire character of this revolution. And that was the entry en masse of the working class into the revolution. And this was a turning point. But I think before I develop this point about the working class even further, I think it's important first to explain what I mean by the definition of the working class. So what I mean is a modern wage labourer owning nothing but their ability to work for a capitalist who conversely does own their means of production, so owns the factory, owns the machinery, owns the tools, etc. So the modern proletariat, the modern working class, is a historical product of capitalism. And so, therefore, the working class, this modern class of wage labourers, was extremely strengthened by the period of industrialisation in Pakistan in the 1960s. And even though in East Pakistan was far less developed industrially than the West, there was still a powerful working class that were employed in the jute industry, which was the main export of East Pakistan, also employed in the railways, the power production, manufacture, and industry. Even in a small and underdeveloped economy like East Pakistan, there could be no, for example, construction of new buildings, no trade, no transport, electricity, healthcare, education, without the working class. Really, in a word, the working class, compared to, for example, students, while they can play an important role, students can, but the working class are a far bigger lever in society. And this was demonstrated in the August Revolution, actually. In July, there was obviously like these huge student protests, people were joining en masse every day, and yet it was the entry of the working class who called a general strike, which eventually led to the overthrow of Hasina. And there was also a similar point in the revolution back in 1969. And this was on the 17th of March. The working class led a general strike, and it shut off electricity even to the presidential palace. And within 7 days, Ayub Khan had abdicated, showing the enormous power that the working class, even in a small backward economy, can have. But it's not the working. We don't base ourselves purely on the working class just because they're good at extracting concessions. There's far more to it than that. It's also because through the working class we can see the formation of a new society without landlords, bankers and capitalists. Because the modern working class are involved in socialised production, so if you imagine a factory or a warehouse, the working class are forced to cooperate in production. And this is reflected, therefore, in their methods of struggle. For example, if you were a factory worker and you weren't happy with your wages and conditions, it's in your interests to collectively organise and lead a strike. But following on from that, the working class can only actually assert their interests and fight for their interests. Collectively, one worker can't just walk out of a factory and expect that their demands are going to be accepted. They have to collectively organise in a strike. And while a strike in a factory poses the question of power in that individual workplace, a general strike, which is the whole of the working class, poses the question of power in the whole of society. But the working class can go further than a general strike. The highest form of the working class struggle is a revolutionary workplace committee. In Russia, they called these Soviets. These are essentially the embryo of workers' self-government, and they emerge in the heat of revolutions of which the working class are involved in. The working class begin to organise the revolution through these democratic committees, and they defend themselves also against the counter-revolution and the state. And if these organs of workers' power, the Soviets, if they actually take power and smash the bourgeois state, they can then begin to democratically plan and organise production on the basis of a workers' state. And this, like I said, forms the embryo of a future socialist society. And because of the working class's relationship in production and them beginning to form these Soviets, throughout the process of a revolution, they will naturally strive towards the abolition of private property and the formation of a worker state. But the working class, unfortunately, are not fully conscious of this fact and the power that they hold in their hands. And it is only through a conscious revolutionary leadership that can actually make them aware of this fact, which can only lead them to the seizing of power. But this is a point I'll develop a bit further on in the talk. But you compare the role of the working class in society, for example, to the peasantry. So the peasantry are a very heterogeneous class. You have lots of different layers of the peasantry who are separated by huge land masses. Like you have rich landowning peasants who often employ lots of other wage labourers who own lots of land. They're closer to like the bourgeois or petty bourgeois. You have middling layers who also may employ wage labour or are quite happy with the lot that they have. But you then have a mass of landless poor peasants who are a bit closer to the working class. But the main demand of the peasantry isn't of collective ownership of the means of production like the working class is. It is of land ownership. Therefore, the peasantry don't develop that collective class consciousness like the modern working class do. This doesn't mean, like the students, for example, that the peasants and students can't be won over to the programme of the working class. But it's the working class, through their revolutionary party, who must convince poor peasants that the only way that they can actually achieve a plot of land and genuine democratic freedoms is through the expropriation of landlords and capitalists, through the seizure of power, through the Soviets. So therefore, the working class would have to lead the revolution. Now, the situation in Pakistan at this point, you had workers occupying their factories, holding their bosses at ransom until their demands were met. But don't take my word for it. There's a really enlightening quote here by Ayub Khan, which I'll read out, who at the time he said, "The administrative institutions are being paralysed. The mobs are resorting to siege at will and get the demands accepted under duress. The situation now is no longer under the control of the government. All government institutions have become victims of coercion, fear and intimidation. Every problem of the country is being decided in the streets." Now, that last point is very important because he was absolutely right at this point. A separate power did exist in society, and that was the power of the working class, organised through their workplace committees. We had a situation of what Lenin called dual power, which was where you had the future socialist society in embryo forming alongside the modern repressive bourgeois state. It was a new society struggling to be born in the old. And so when the working class enter the revolution, like I said, they naturally draw these anti-capitalist conclusions, encroaching on private property. Now the students were able to tap into this. The moderate 6-point programme originally put forward by the Awami League was actually then superseded by the 11-point programme of the students. And this contained democratic demands such as universal suffrage. It also contained things like the right to strike, free education, housing, things like that. But a really important point, I'd say the most important point about this program, was that they included the nationalisation of the commanding heights of the economy. And because the revolution had assumed this anti-capitalist character, with a bold program of social demands linking the question of national independence to the question of property, they were able to win over the working class and drive the revolution forward. And I think this is a really important lesson to take forward to today. And this was a very similar point to what the revolution reached in August. You had a mass movement that brought down the government, and the question of power was posed. The students and workers began to form these committees, or these Soviets in embryo, and the power was posed: who runs society, workers and students, or is it the capitalists? And yeah, like this situation of dual power that existed in Pakistan at this time and existed in Bangladesh this summer also existed in February 1917 in Russia. But it was Lenin who understood that the situation of dual power could not last indefinitely. The ruling class wouldn't allow an armed body of men separate to that of their own armed bodies of men. And at the end of the day, a revolutionary mass of people can't be kept in a continuous state of revolutionary ferment forever. Either unless one of them, unless the working class through their committees take power, then the counter-revolution would be able to stamp it out at one point or the other. It was the task of the Bolsheviks between February and October 1917 of winning over the working class for the need for a second revolution, to overthrow the bourgeois state, to smash it and replace it with the working class organising their Soviets. And it was exactly the same position that was across the whole of Pakistan at this time, and the exact same task was posed to the student leaders, Bashani, and the leaders in West Pakistan, of which I don't have time to go into. That's a whole separate book. But at this point, had the leaders have done this, smashed the state, nationalised the economy, put it into the hands of the working class, organising their committees, called on the peasants to seize their land, decree the breaking up of the landed estates, we would have seen a peaceful transition of power to the working class. And on the basis of a workers' state, East Pakistan would have been able to choose to either join in a federation of socialist states with West Pakistan, or it would have been given the opportunity to secede completely and form its own nation state. Then an international appeal could have been put out to the workers of West Bengal, who are also in a revolutionary ferment, and then to the rest of India to overthrow their own governments and form in a socialist federation of the subcontinent. There could have then been a harmonious plan of production to raise the living standards of everybody and lay the basis for genuine freedom and national liberation and rights to all minority groups within the subcontinent. But this could only have been done if a party had placed itself at the head of the working class who took power. But because no decisive lead was given, the movement eventually ebbed, and Bashani, who was leader of the NAP, quickly lost hold of the leadership. So at this point, a military general called Yahya Khan was replaced Ayub Khan with a military junta. He called martial law, but also to try and give some sops to the masses, gave some minor trade union reforms, and then announced elections for a year's time based upon universal suffrage. So just to recap, before I go into the next point. So the national oppression of Bengalis produced a revolution along class lines and could only succeed if the working class took power, but because the leadership refused, the movement was then directed straight into the arms of the middle-class petty bourgeois leaders. Now this was a role that Mujib and his Awami League were all too willing to play. So the West Pakistani ruling class actually hoped that these elections would be split between a multitude of peasant nationalists or Islamic parties, so that they could allow them to demoralise the masses and then continue to rule them through repression and things like that. But because at this point Mujib was the only leader with any authority throughout the whole of East Pakistan, he won a thumping majority. So I don't know any fair elections who have won such a big majority, but the Awami League won 160 out of 162 seats across East Pakistan. What an absolutely crushing majority this was, and a damning indictment of the basis of the state of Pakistan. But this wasn't just a majority in East Pakistan. It meant that Mujib had the majority across the whole of Pakistan, including the West, which was which was 1,200 miles away. What an absurd situation for Mujib to have been allowed to declare themselves prime minister. I tried to think of analogies that we could understand in Britain, and I know it's not an exact analogy, but imagine if at the last election, the SNP or Sinn Féin won a majority throughout the whole of Britain and then declared themselves to be prime minister, yet the island of Scotland was actually in Italy. Like, what an absolutely absurd situation of which the British ruling class was simply would never allow to happen. And just as the British ruling class couldn't allow that, the West Pakistani ruling class could not allow this either. Because it was a de facto mandate for the independence of the Bengalis and a breakup of the country. And it would have meant the loss of the right to exploit it as a colony, and therefore, again, the loss of a significant portion of their income. And what clearly flows from this is the need to drive out the West Pakistani landlord and capitalist class by the revolutionary seizure of power by the working class. But Mujib was never willing to do this, the only thing necessary to win independence. His strategy was always to find a negotiated settlement. And this can be explained by the class composition of the Awami League. And so the Awami League leadership and its main supporters were from the emerging Bengali middle classes. So these were small and medium-sized land and business owners. And independence for them was different to that of the peasants and the working class. Independence for them meant right to freely exploit Bangladeshi labour. And so, to a point, they were willing to lean on the mass upsurge of the movement, but only to ever exert pressure to gain minor concessions so that they could gain a seat at the table to be able to, exploit Bengali labour. But because this revolution inevitably involved the working class, it inevitably then encroached on private property, i.e. the property that these small and middle-sized business and landowners owned. And they were terrified that the mobilization of the masses, particularly the working class, would slip out of their hands and they would demand way more than simply independence, but actually socialism. And therefore, the petty bourgeois leaders of the Awami League were more terrified at all times of the mass movement than they ever were of the West Pakistani military and their ruling class. And this explains the actions of Mujib throughout this period. Because while Mujib demanded the convening of the National Assembly, Yahya Khan then postponed it. Like I said, there was no way he was going to allow the convening of a National Assembly with the Bengali at its head. And this unleashed fury throughout East Pakistan. And there's a really good anecdote, actually, with this. It was a first-hand account, and it was someone at a cricket game. And there was 40,000 people there. And they were all listening to their radio sets, listening to the commentary. And then when it was announced over the radio that they were postponing the National Assembly, 40,000 of them en masse left the stadium, picked up whatever they could, whatever weapons they could, baseball bats, bamboo sticks, crowbars, and marched on the capital and demanded the convening of the National Assembly and therefore independence. So this was, we can see here how the whip of the counter-revolution had reignited the mass movement. And you had mass demonstrations across the whole of East Pakistan with millions on the street. You had revolutionary poetry being shown on occupied TV stations, telling people to join the movement and get out on the streets and demonstrate. You had, I read another first-hand account where it was somebody's mother of a revolutionary left-wing student. And him and his friends, day and night, all the time, they were talking about, she didn't say they were talking about religion, they weren't talking about this or that minor nationalist politician. They were talking about Marx, Engels, Lenin, Che Guevara. They were talking about Marxist revolutionaries. This is what they were talking about. They had this mass revolutionary wave across the whole of East Pakistan. Every house had the new flag of Bangladesh flying proudly outside. You'd have thought with such an overwhelming support for independence, the great Democrat, Mujib, would have called independence as there was a mass majority, a massive majority for it. But every demonstration he addressed, all of the people who went there left disappointed. And there's a really telling anecdote of one of the main student leaders at this time who was chaperoning Mujib around Pakistan, going into talks with Yahya Khan. And this student leader, as a joke, slapped a sticker of the new flag of Bangladesh onto Mujib's car. And Mujib turned around and went absolutely furious at him and said, "You're trying to undermine the negotiations I'm having with the Pakistani leaders. Like, how dare you do this?" And I think what this really shows is the psychology of the petty bourgeoisie during a period of revolution. And this was the theme throughout the 3-week period. He was frantically trying to meet with the authorities, continuously watering down his program and pleading for them, just please give some SOPs so that we can send the masses home and we can have a nice negotiated settlement. He even is quoted to have said, don't they know that I'm the only one who can stop the communists? I think he says it himself, if you don't give me something, the communists are going to take control and you're all going to lose your property. It was, I think, again, it was just a really insightful point about how the petty bourgeois Democrats react to a mass movement of the masses. And at this point, the revolution culminated in the 23rd of March. There was a general strike called. Every single person you could imagine in society was out demanding independence. They thought independence was going to be called. You'd think this would be the time to do it, and they all thought he was going to call it. And what ended with all this potential finished as almost like a day of celebration. It was like a carnival. And again, everybody left disappointed. Had a revolutionary leadership at this point existed, with its roots in the working class and the student movement, they could have easily won the leadership of that movement. They would have called on the working class to seize power and declared independence through through power being taken into the hands of the working class. But unfortunately, this leadership didn't exist. And Mujib was never willing to do what was necessary to actually complete independence. However, this time the lack of a clear and decisive leadership would have disastrous consequences. And 2 days later, the West Pakistani army invaded on an unarmed population. And with the help of Islamic fundamentalist militias recruited from a party called the Jamaat-e-Islami, they went on a systematic campaign of murder, torture, and sexual violence. And nobody knows actually how many people died during the War of Independence, but it's predicted between 300,000 to 3 million. It's often called a genocide, of which I would agree with, actually. 8.9 people were displaced into India, and thousands of women, there's hundreds of documented evidence of women being raped and systematic sexual violence being perpetrated to Bengali women, especially Hindu Bengali women. And this was painted, I think, a really good kind of picture of what was going on at this time. There's a quote I'll read from a retired West Pakistani officer who was involved in this campaign. And he said, "After a day of fighting, we took many Bengalis captive. We sent them to the unit HQ. I don't know what they did to those men or women. At the end of the day, when I looked around, I saw the whole place strewn with body parts. There were decapitated bodies, heads without bodies, dismembered arms and legs littered all over the place. Dogs were roaming about the place. They were feeding on human beings. Scores of vultures were descending too. And the dogs and vultures were fighting over human body parts." Now, this was the unnecessary price that the Bengali masses paid for weak and indecisive leadership. Because all of the leaders at this point refused to base themselves upon the only class which could have carried through genuine independence, and this was the working class. But yeah, so this was the end of this revolutionary period. The War of Independence completely cut through this revolutionary mood. But I think anyone who knows a Bangladeshi in here, you'll know that they don't give up without a fight, especially if they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. There was hundreds of thousands of men, women, and even children fled to the countryside and formed the Liberation Army, and they fought like tigers against a foreign occupying force. I'll quote this same West Pakistani officer when he talks about this. He said, "Our officers were very corrupt, but the Bengalis were loyal to their land. Even when we took their families hostage and shot them dead, some of them died shouting 'Joy Bangla,' which was a nationalist slogan. The war lasted for 9 months, and the Liberation Army, which at first was being pegged back to the borders of India, soon began to gain a lot of ground against these corrupt, these armies led by corrupt army officers. And you had a group of radical left-wing officers alongside the most self-sacrificing, dedicated students who formed the best fighting units in the war. And these officers had over 100,000 revolutionary soldiers at their command. And at one point, they were on the verge of marching into Dhaka and liberating the population. Now, the Indian ruling class were very, very concerned at this point, because if this revolutionary army had reached Dhaka, acted been seen as liberators, this war could have ended like the Chinese Revolution or the Cuban Revolution, which was like this, a bunch of revolutionary guerrilla fighters who would have come in, nationalized the economy, and it could have then spread across the whole of India and Pakistan and then, again, threatened their property and their interests. And so in order to stop this, the Indian ruling class and the army were able to reach Dhaka before these revolutionary students and radical army officers, and they were able to stage manage the end of the war. And they were able to then implement Mujib as prime minister, who was then going to carry through the interests of the Indian ruling class. So we can see throughout this period, independence was never won by these clever middle-class intellectual types or from idealistic Indian army officers, but through the active participation of the Bengali masses at every decisive moment in the revolution. And actually, it was these layers who drove the movement forward, despite Mujib's best attempts to apply the brakes at every single point of the revolution. But after the war, the country was completely ruined. The economic and social fabric had been completely torn apart. But because the West Pakistani landlords and the capitalists had been driven out by force, and no Bengali capitalist class existed to fill the vacuum, Mujib was actually reluctantly forced to nationalize the commanding heights of the economy. This was the precondition for independence, like I'd explained previously, but this could have been done in a progressive way. The working class could have taken control of society, democratically planned production, and won independence in that way, but instead, it was done through a ferocious civil war with needless death and destruction. So instead of a harmonious plan of production and a socialist federation of the subcontinent, which would have changed the course of history, instead, Mujib oversaw a brutally repressive regime that was marked by rampant corruption. Just an example of this level of corruption. So between 1972 and 75, there was a devastating famine. And one of the aid agencies in Dhaka was led by a leader of the Awami League, and he hoarded foreign aid and sold it on the black market for super profits in the midst of a famine. And this was just the tip of the iceberg of the Awami League's corruption. And within 3 years, Mujib had gone from the most loved man in Bangladesh to the most hated. And he'd lost all of his support in society. And by 1975, there was a coup attempt of an army faction. And again, these guys had no basis in society. They were couped again by a different army faction who again didn't have any base in society. And this left an enormous power vacuum of which had to be filled by something. And so all these radical left-wing officers and students that I'd mentioned at the end of the war had formed a left-wing nationalist party called the JSD. And they organized an insurrection and led behind them thousands of workers, peasants, and students. But they didn't seize power. They handed it to some reactionary officer called Zia-ur-Rahman, who they thought was going to act as a neutral and who would just develop the economy and act in the nation's independence or whatever that would mean. And within 9 days, Zia had rounded up all of the leaders of the insurrection, even killing some of them or killing the main leader of it. He ruled with an iron fist, privatized the economy, and stamped out all of the revolutionary traditions and memory of the War of Independence and the revolutions around it. He then formed the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, the BNP, of which the leader is, I think now, was the wife of Zia. And so really the formation of the BNP and the taking of power by Zia, they drowned the revolution in blood. The masses throughout this whole period had 3 attempts to take power, and they showed the utmost courage and determination, but the leaders failed them again and again. And since this period of time, the Bangladeshi people have had the choice between 2 sets of corrupt gangsters to choose between, either those of the Awami League or those of the BNP. But now a Bangladeshi capitalist class does exist, and it's a powerful capitalist class that is completely subordinate to imperialism. I'll give an example. So after the August Revolution, Dr. Yunus, this economist, was put in as kind of a neutral figure to head the provisional government. He met with the country's garment manufacturers. And they warned him that unless he keeps wages low and uses the state to repress and maintain order, these like Primark, Zara, they're going to offshore. They're going to buy their garments from elsewhere with worse labour conditions. And so I think this proves really who really benefited from the independence war? Essentially, it gave the Bangladeshi capitalist class and the foreign multinationals freedom to exploit poor Bangladeshis. That's essentially who gained freedom from this period. And this reminds me of a poignant phrase once said by the Irish Marxist revolutionary, James Connolly. If you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. England will still rule you through our capitalists, through our landlords, through our financiers, through the whole host of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs. If you change the colour of the flags and the names of the countries involved, you get a profound summation of the events of Bangladesh for the past 53 years. Because ultimately, the working class, the students, the peasantry, they don't feel free under a formerly free Bangladesh. And this was proven this August in the revolution that overthrew Hasina. The fact that it was coined as a second independence, I think, demonstrates this fact that actually true independence was never won. The revolutions of 1960 and 70s, and then of August 2024 this summer, the tasks of which remain unfinished, and the key lessons remain the same. And I'll briefly go over these and remind everyone of these. So firstly, you cannot achieve genuine democracy as long as property remains in private hands. The garment bosses are completely intertwined with the old Awami League regime and the state. How many of these garment bosses were also Awami League members whose hands are stained with the blood of thousands of workers and students who fought back? While the head of the state remains, there is a mini Hasina in every single workplace that still controls the economy and has control over the repressive state apparatus. They're simply hiding behind this figure, Dr. Yunus, and waiting for an opportune moment to strike. And this leads to the second key lesson, is that the working class must play a leading role. And this was one of the main strengths in the 1960s and 70s, and again was a major strength of 2024 in August. But the working class now is much stronger and more powerful in Bangladesh. For example, there are more workers today in Bangladesh than the entire population was in East Pakistan in 1970. But they're not only being quantitatively bigger, they're also qualitatively more powerful too. So 2% of workers in Bangladesh, 2% of the population in Bangladesh are employed in the garment sector, which controls 16% of the economy, of which the economy massively relies on. That's 4 million workers. 80% of, by the way, are women, hold the power to paralyze the entire economy. The students, can play a very important role, like they have done this summer, but without the active participation of the working class, the only class who can actually smash the bourgeois state and replace it with a worker state, the threat of the counter-revolution gaining the upper hand will always remain. And thirdly, and finally, the most important point is the need for a revolutionary leadership, not just a revolutionary leader, revolutionary Marxist leadership that can apply all of these lessons in practice and fuse the most revolutionary students with the vanguard of the working class. Because there is currently in Bangladesh an enormous power vacuum, and it has to be filled with something. And until it's filled by the Revolutionary Party of the working class, the period ahead is going to be a very protracted one. And just like Zia in 1972 to 75, just like he was, there are factions circling and manoeuvring behind the scene at the moment, waiting for the moment to strike the decisive blow against the revolution. The knot of history is being retied. The Bangladeshi workers and students are rediscovering their rich revolutionary heritage. Now, though, the task is to draw all the necessary lessons and conclusion and finish Bangladesh's unfinished revolution. Thanks.